The summers in Fayetteville, North Carolina, were always long and sweltering. The oppressive heat blanketed the small town surrounding Fort Liberty, formerly known as Fort Bragg, one of the largest military bases in the United States. It wasn't just a workplace for thousands of service members. It was home to families who had long learned to live with the absence of a spouse for months at a time. James Carter, 44, was a logistics officer in the U.S. Army with over 20 years of service. Long deployments, classified missions, and grueling training exercises had become a routine part of his life. His wife, Rachel Carter, 41, was a high school teacher. They had been married for nearly 2 decades, raising a small family with 2 teenage children, Emily, 16, and Noah, 13. Their marriage had endured too many separations. Rachel once believed she would grow accustomed to James being away for months at a time, but each time he left, the distance between them seemed to widen a little more. The calls became less frequent, the messages reduced to habitual good morning and good night texts. When James returned home, they felt awkward, more like roommates than husband and wife. Not far from the Carter household, Sarah Mitchell, 39, was also living the life of a military wife. Her husband, Ethan Mitchell, was a Special Forces soldier, currently deployed in the Middle East for a year-long mission. Sarah had once been a nurse in the Army, but after having their daughter, she chose to stay home to care for their family. With 10-year-old Lily, Sarah did her best to appear strong, but deep down, the emptiness gnawed at her. Sarah and Rachel were neighbors and close friends. They often confided in each other, sharing the burdens of being military wives, women who had to pretend everything was fine, even when their world was quietly falling apart. Then, in the midst of a long, lonely summer, their lives unexpectedly intertwined in a way neither of them could have foreseen. Mornings at Fort Liberty always started early. Before the sun had fully risen, soldiers were already assembled on the training grounds, the rhythmic pounding of their boots against the concrete forming a familiar cadence. James Carter had always been an early riser. Even at 44, he maintained military discipline, a cup of black coffee, a light workout, then the drive to base. His work no longer held the same excitement as it once did in his younger years. Now, it was mostly paperwork, deployment planning, and logistics management. Rachel began her mornings in the rush of a mother managing 2 kids. She prepared breakfast, checked Emily and Noah's homework, and then hurried off to teach American literature at the local high school. The busy mornings kept her from thinking too much about James's absence. Sarah Mitchell had slower mornings. After dropping Lily off at school, she often went to the town's gym for a workout. It wasn't just about staying in shape. It was her way of dealing with the stress of living alone for so long. Their lives ran in repetitive cycles, until one day, a small coincidence changed everything. A light rain fell on a late summer afternoon. James Carter didn't have much to do at the base that day, so he decided to stop by a small cafe in town to escape the heat. The cafe, nestled on a street corner, was quiet and uncrowded, a perfect place for some solitude. As he walked in, he didn't expect to see a familiar face. Sarah Mitchell sat by the window, her cappuccino half finished in front of her. She glanced up, momentarily surprised, then smiled. "James? You come here often." James hesitated for a second before stepping closer, unsure whether to simply greet her or sit down. But there was something in Sarah's gaze that put him at ease, perhaps the recognition of a loneliness he had tried to suppress. "Yeah, just needed a break from the heat," he replied, gesturing to the chair across from her. "Mind if I join you?" Sarah nodded. They started with casual conversation, family, work, but gradually, their talk became more personal. Sarah spoke about the emptiness of Ethan's absence, the long nights alone in bed. James listened, nodding occasionally, because he understood that feeling better than most. Time slipped by unnoticed. When they finally stepped outside, the rain had slowed to a gentle drizzle. Sarah smiled lightly. "It's strange, talking to you like this. Normally, we only see each other at family get-togethers." James chuckled, though there was something unreadable in his expression. "Maybe it's because we never stop to really talk." She looked at him, as if she wanted to say something else, but instead, she simply nodded. "See you around, James." And they walked away, unaware that this encounter had planted a seed for something neither of them had ever considered. After that chance meeting at the cafe, James and Sarah began noticing each other in a different way. Not because they had never met before, but because, for the first time, they truly saw each other, saw the voids, the silent longings they had both tried to ignore. James Carter had always prided himself on his discipline. He could command an entire unit with absolute precision, yet he found himself powerless in controlling his own emotions. Since that day, Sarah lingered in his thoughts more often than she should. While running in the morning, sitting at his desk or driving home, her presence was there, not in an overwhelming or obsessive way, but like a quiet tide that slowly, persistently, crept into every corner of his mind. That night, as he lay in bed beside Rachel, James became acutely aware of the distance between them. She was turned away from him, reading under the soft glow of the bedside lamp. There was no fight, no argument, just a silence that had stretched too far between them. He wondered, when was the last time he truly felt connected to Rachel? And he couldn't remember. Sarah Mitchell wasn't faring much better. She had told herself she had adjusted to Ethan's absence, but after that conversation with James, she realized she wasn't as okay as she had thought. Sarah felt restless as she checked her phone, as if she were waiting for a message, even though she wasn't sure from whom. Every time she ran into James around the military housing area or in town, her heart would beat just a little faster. One evening, after Lily had gone to bed, Sarah sat on the couch, scrolling through old photos of herself and Ethan. In every picture, they were smiling, but she couldn't remember the last time she had truly felt happy with her husband. She felt like she was standing on a thin wire. On one side was her safe, familiar marriage, and on the other was something new, dangerous, yet undeniably alluring. Sarah didn't know if she had the courage to cross that line, but she knew one thing for sure. She was thinking about James more than she should. In the days following their conversation at the cafe, Sarah and James started running into each other more often. At first, it was coincidental, but gradually, they both began to make subtle efforts to be in each other's orbit. One late afternoon, James pulled into the parking lot of a small grocery store near the base to pick up a few things, something Rachel usually took care of. As he pushed his cart down the aisle, he suddenly heard a familiar voice. "James?" Sarah was standing by the produce section, holding a bag of apples in one hand and pushing her cart with the other. She wore simple jeans and a white button-up shirt, looking like she had just come from the gym. "Sarah," he nodded, trying to appear casual. She smiled lightly. "You're grocery shopping? I thought military men never set foot in supermarkets." James shrugged, smiling back. "Normally, I don't, but today, I needed a little quiet." His words made Sarah laugh. "A grocery store is quiet?" James chuckled along with her, and for a moment, they both lingered, neither in a hurry to leave. "Are you heading home tonight?" Sarah asked softly, her voice carrying something unspoken. James hesitated for a brief second. "Yeah, I always go home." Sarah nodded, her eyes meeting his. It was just a simple exchange between two acquaintances, but they both knew it meant something more. They walked away in different directions, yet their minds remained entangled. A week later, James decided to hit the gym earlier than usual. He figured some exercise might help clear his head. But as soon as he walked in, he spotted Sarah. She was already on the treadmill, her headphones resting loosely around her neck, her hair tied up in a high ponytail. Her fitted tank top hugged her toned frame, revealing tan shoulders. As James moved toward the weightlifting area, their eyes met in the mirror. It lasted only a second, but it was enough to make both of them feel caught in something they shouldn't be in. Sarah pulled off her headphones and walked toward the weights where James was warming up. "Do you usually work out at this time?" she asked, keeping her tone light. James nodded. "Sometimes." "You?" "Sometimes." They stood there in silence, only the sounds of weights hitting the floor and steady breathing filling the space. But the silence wasn't empty. As Sarah bent down to tie her shoe, James caught himself watching her. There was something dangerously close about this moment, like a fuse waiting to be lit. Sarah stood back up, wiping sweat from her forehead, then gave him a lingering look before turning away. "See you around, James." James only nodded, but as she walked off, he realized his heart was beating faster than usual. After that, their encounters were no longer entirely accidental. Sarah started stopping by the cafe James frequented in the mornings, and sometimes, James found himself lingering in his car when he saw Sarah walking Lily to the school bus. They hadn't crossed any lines. Not yet, but the anticipation had begun creeping into every interaction. They never spoke of it, but both of them knew. Something was forming between them, something they weren't sure they could control. James Carter had never thought of himself as the kind of man who would betray his wife. In over 20 years of marriage, he had been through it all, the passionate early years, the busy years with kids, and now the unsettling distance that had crept in. But even as his relationship with Rachel cooled, he had always held onto his principles. Until now, every time he saw Sarah, whether by chance or by choice, he felt like he was walking a razor-thin edge. He knew he shouldn't feel this way, but he also couldn't deny that Sarah made him feel something he hadn't felt in a long time. To be seen, to be heard, to be wanted. One late night, with Rachel already asleep, James sat alone in the garage, nursing a glass of whiskey. He picked up his phone, opened his messages, and hesitated. There was nothing wrong with a simple text, right? "James, Sarah, are you still awake?" He stared at the screen, his finger hovering over the send button. But after a few seconds, he locked the screen, sighed, and set the phone aside. No, he wasn't ready to cross that line. Sarah wasn't doing much better. She felt a rush of energy after every encounter with James. Yet she also felt a pang of guilt every time she looked at the wedding photo on her desk. She loved Ethan, or at least she had loved him. But over the past year, their marriage had dwindled into rushed video calls and brief text exchanges. "I'm good. Sleep well." She needed more than that. One night, after Lily had gone to bed, Sarah sat alone on the couch, phone in hand. She opened her messages with James. There wasn't much there, just a few brief conversations about family gatherings and shared events. Sarah typed a message. "Sarah, James, are you going to bed early?" She hesitated. Should she send it or delete it? But before she could decide, her phone buzzed. A message from Ethan. "Ethan, I miss you." Sarah stared at those words for a long time, then sighed and deleted the message she had meant to send to James. She wasn't ready, but she also knew that something inside her was beginning to shift. In the days that followed, James and Sarah continued to see each other, continued their harmless conversations. But they both knew that once someone crossed the line, there would be no turning back. They were standing at the edge of a precipice, and it would take only the slightest breeze to send them falling. That evening, James left the base later than usual. He had planned to drive straight home, but as he passed the familiar cafe, he saw Sarah standing under the awning, clutching her thin jacket tightly against the downpour. Without thinking, James pulled over and rolled down the window. "You didn't bring an umbrella?" Sarah turned, surprised to see him. "I didn't think it would rain this hard." James glanced at the dark sky, then back at her. His decision was simple. "Get in. I'll take you home." She hesitated for just a second before opening the door and slipping into the passenger seat, bringing with her the damp chill of the rain and the soft scent of something floral. The car rolled forward in silence. The rain drummed against the windshield, the streetlights casting blurred reflections on the wet glass. Sarah pulled out her phone, typed a quick message, then stared at the screen. No reply from Ethan. She sighed, rubbing her hands together for warmth. James glanced at her. "Cold?" She nodded slightly. Without thinking, James reached over and took her hands in his. His touch was warm and firm. Sarah flinched, startled, but didn't pull away. For a few long seconds, they just sat there like that, the moment stretching endlessly between them. The warmth seeped through her skin, spreading through her body. Sarah turned to look at him. There was nothing in his eyes that said this was a mistake, and she wasn't sure she wanted to see it as one. They didn't kiss. Nothing crossed the line, but they both knew this was a moment that could not be undone. When they pulled up in front of Sarah's house, she didn't immediately get out. The rain had softened, but neither of them wanted to be the first to break the silence. Finally, Sarah gave his hand a gentle squeeze before letting go. "Thank you, James." James only nodded. He didn't trust his voice at that moment. Sarah opened the door, stepped out into the night, and disappeared behind the front door. James sat in his car for a long while, staring at his hands, where the warmth of her skin still lingered. He knew from this moment on nothing would ever be the same. After that rainy night, something changed between them. They never spoke about it, never acknowledged it in words. But it was there, undeniable, in the way their eyes lingered too long and their silences became heavy with meaning. At the cafe, when James stood in line behind Sarah, he noticed the way she shifted slightly, as if she was acutely aware of his presence. When she turned to look at him, their gazes locked for just a second too long. At the gym, when Sarah passed by, the faint scent of her perfume made James hold his breath. She noticed, pausing for just a beat before continuing, but the way her ears flushed red gave her away. Everything was subtle. No words were spoken that shouldn't be, but they could both feel it, the crackling tension between them, like a live wire waiting for a single touch to ignite. Every time he went home, it felt like he was stepping into a different world. Rachel was the same, attentive, composed, but distant. Their dinners were filled with conversations about their son, finances, schedules. There was nothing wrong, but there was also nothing that made him feel alive. And Sarah? Sarah made him remember what it felt like to be wanted. When he was with her, he wasn't Major James Carter, the responsible husband, the steady father. He was just James. A man, a person with a heartbeat, with desires that had been buried for too long. But if he crossed the line, he would lose everything. Was it worth it? Every time Ethan called from the Middle East, she felt like a fraud. She still said the right things, still smiled, still played the role of a good wife. But deep inside, a question echoed louder and louder. If you really miss me, then why do I still feel so alone? She hadn't done anything wrong. Not yet. But the fact that she had to remind herself of that alone was a warning sign. That night, after Lily had fallen asleep, Sarah sat on her bed, her hand hovering over her phone, hesitant. Finally, she typed a short message. "Sarah, are you still awake?" A few seconds later, the message was seen. But James didn't reply immediately. Sarah set her phone down, sighing. She knew they were standing at a crossroads, and she wasn't sure if she could stop. James sat in the garage, his phone resting on an old wooden table. "Sarah, are you still awake?" He looked at the message, his emotions swirling. Part of him wanted to turn off the phone, pretend he hadn't seen it. But another part, a stronger part, wanted to reply. Finally, he picked up the phone, his fingers gliding lightly over the keyboard. "James, not yet. What's wrong?" Less than a minute later, a response appeared. "Sarah, just couldn't sleep." James stared at those words for a long time. He knew exactly what that felt like. The next day, James left work earlier than usual. He didn't go home right away. Instead, he drove to a small park where he knew Sarah often took Lily on the weekends. He wasn't sure why he was there. It was just a feeling pulling at him. When he parked, Sarah was already there. Alone. She was sitting on a bench, wearing a cream-colored sweater, her hands wrapped around a paper coffee cup. When she saw James, she froze for a moment, then smiled slightly, as if this was something inevitable. "Do you like this place too?" she asked as he sat down beside her. "Not really. But today, I just felt like going somewhere." Sarah nodded. "So did I." They sat together, saying nothing, with only the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. After a long while, Sarah sighed softly. "James, do you think we should stop?" James turned to look at her. "Do you want to stop?" Sarah gave a faint smile. "If I did, I wouldn't have texted you last night." James stayed silent. This was the moment where all boundaries would be blurred. Finally, Sarah set her coffee cup down and turned to face him. "I don't know where this is going, but I know I don't want to pretend it's not happening." James didn't answer right away. He just looked at her for a long time. Then, as if surrendering, he reached out. His fingers brushed lightly against the back of her hand. Sarah didn't pull away. And in that moment, they both knew they had crossed a line from which there was no return. The small hotel room was bathed in a soft, artificial warmth from the dim yellow lights. James stood by the window, his hand resting on his hip, his mind racing. Sarah was still standing near the bed, her hands gripping the strap of her handbag. They both knew what was about to happen. No one had forced anyone. No words had been spoken to confirm whether this was right or wrong. But after so many sleepless nights, after those seemingly accidental touches, here they were, alone in a space with no watchful eyes, no responsibilities, no obligations. James took a deep breath and turned to face her. "We can still stop." Sarah looked up, her eyes clouded as if searching for a reason to turn back. But then she took off her coat and placed it on the chair. She had made her choice. James moved closer, slowly, as if any sudden movement could shatter the moment. When his hand touched her cheek, Sarah closed her eyes, leaning slightly into the warmth of his palm. It felt gentle, comforting, yet filled with forbidden desire. And then, unable to wait any longer, James leaned in. The first kiss. It wasn't rushed, it wasn't greedy. It was a confirmation, a surrender. Their breaths mingled. Their trembling fingers brushed over skin, as if they were etching every moment into memory. No words were spoken, but as their clothes fell to the floor, as their skin touched, they both knew that nothing would ever be the same again. James could feel Sarah's heartbeat, her warmth, and the long-repressed vulnerability she carried. He was no longer Major Carter. She was no longer Ethan's wife. They were just two people, stripped bare, both physically and emotionally. When it was all over, Sarah lay still, her head resting on James' chest. The room was silent except for their steady breaths. She whispered softly, "What do we do now?" James didn't answer, because he didn't know either. But one thing was certain, there was no turning back now. The hotel room was bathed in the faint, hazy light of early morning, the warmth of the sheets still lingering. Beside her, James was still asleep, his arm draped possessively over her waist. She lay still, staring at the ceiling. This was the moment when she should feel regret. But she didn't. Sarah turned her head slightly to look at James. The marks of time were clear on his face, wrinkles at the corners of his eyes, a touch of gray at his temples. He looked more at peace than she had ever seen him. This was another man, a man who made her feel seen, desired, alive. But when she thought of Ethan, an unease crept into her chest. He had once held her like this. He had once been the only person who made her feel safe. And yet, now, as she touched James, she realized just how lonely she had been in her marriage. James woke up to the faint movement of Sarah beside him. He opened his eyes and saw her sitting at the edge of the bed, lightly pulling the sheet over her bare body. The sight made his heart sink. He sat up and reached out, his fingers barely grazing her back. Sarah flinched slightly, but she didn't pull away. "Are you okay?" James asked, his morning voice still low and husky. She didn't answer right away. She turned to look at him, holding his gaze for a long time, as if searching for something. Finally, she gave a small nod. "Yeah." But they both knew that wasn't the truth. Sarah wrapped the sheet around herself and stood up. "I should go." James got out of bed, pulling on his clothes. He didn't try to stop her. There were no goodbye hugs, no last kiss, just one long, deep look. And as Sarah walked out the door, James wasn't sure if this was the end or just the beginning. Sarah drove home in a daze. The streets were just as busy as always. Traffic lights flickered from green to red. But to her, the world felt off, light, unsteady, as if she was floating between two realities. She had just committed adultery. That was the undeniable truth. But instead of guilt strangling her, all she felt was a strange emptiness. Ethan would never know. Her daughter was still asleep in their little home, completely unaware that her mother had just lost a part of herself in another man's arms. So why was the strongest emotion in her chest regret? not for what she had done, but for leaving that room too soon. James came home just before noon. Rachel was in the kitchen, her hair tied up in a high ponytail, wearing that familiar gray sweater. She turned to look at him, smiling. "You're home early." James hesitated for just a second. The question was simple, but unbearably heavy. If Rachel knew where he had just been, if she knew what he had done, would that smile still exist? He stepped forward and placed a soft kiss on her forehead. "I was just feeling a little tired." Rachel nodded and went back to what she was doing. No suspicion, no questioning, and that, more than anything else, made James feel worse. He didn't deserve her trust. And yet, if Sarah texted him right now, could he say no? James wasn't sure. The entire day passed, and neither of them reached out. Sarah didn't open her phone. She spent the day with Lily, took her to the park, cooked dinner like usual. But when night fell, when the house grew quiet, she sat on her bed, staring at her screen. James did the same. He picked up his phone, then set it back down. There was too much to say, but also nothing to say at all. They had gone too far, but not far enough to call it an ending. And they both knew. Sarah tried to live as if nothing had happened. She still woke up early, still made breakfast for Lily, still sent Ethan a morning text like she always did. Everything around her functioned as usual, but she was no longer the same. When Lily hugged her before school, something tightened in her chest. When Ethan called from his base, his voice warmed through the phone. She still smiled as she spoke, but it was no longer a real smile, because in her mind, James was still there. His warmth, the feel of his skin against hers, the rushed breaths they shared, the things she shouldn't remember, but couldn't forget. One message, one decision. James sat in his office, staring at his computer screen, not reading a single word. He was supposed to be working, but his mind kept drifting back to Sarah, to the way she looked at him that morning, to those moments in the hotel room. His phone vibrated on the desk. "Sarah, we need to talk." His heart clenched. He picked up the phone, but he didn't reply immediately, because he knew, once they met again, they wouldn't just talk. That night, while Rachel slept beside him, James got out of bed. He stepped outside to the porch, where no one could hear him. He dialed Sarah's number. The phone rang 3 times before she picked up. Neither of them spoke. James could hear her breathing. She could hear his too. Finally, Sarah spoke first. "I can't stop thinking about you." James closed his eyes. Her words felt like a dagger piercing his chest, painful yet sweet. He should have said they needed to stop, that this was a mistake, that they had to return to their families. But what he actually said was, "I can't either." And with that, they took another step toward the abyss. They met again one late afternoon at a small cafe in the suburbs, a safe place where no one knew them. Sarah arrived first, sitting in a secluded corner, her hands wrapped tightly around a cup of tea, her palms ice cold. She wasn't sure what she was doing here. They should have stopped. But instead of running away, she had been the one to text James. And now, here he was, standing in front of her, his gaze deep, dangerous. Sarah looked up, trying to keep her composure. "I just want to talk." James pulled out a chair and sat down, a small smile on his lips. "We both know this isn't just talking." They sat across from each other, the space between them seemingly small yet heavier than anything else. Sarah bit her lip, finally voicing what had been tormenting her for days. "We can't keep doing this." James nodded. "I know. We both have families. I know. I don't want to destroy everything." James looked at her for a long time. "But you don't want to stop either." Sarah clenched her hands together, unable to deny it. She knew they had gone too far, but a part of her, the part she had long forgotten, couldn't let go of this feeling. The longing, the thrill, the sensation of touching someone not out of duty, but out of pure desire. "So what do we do?" she whispered. James didn't answer right away. He reached out, his fingers brushing lightly over her wrist, slow, deliberate. Sarah shivered. James leaned in, his voice low and warm. "One last time. One last time and then we'll stop. Sarah closed her eyes. She knew it was a lie, but as their hands clasped beneath the table, she also knew she wouldn't refuse. Sarah didn't remember how they ended up at the hotel. One moment they had been in the cafe hesitating over words. The next, the door had closed behind them, and they crashed into each other like drowning souls desperate for air. No more distance, no more excuses. Only two people, two bodies, two souls that had yearned for each other far too long. Emotion exploded, nothing left to hide. James pressed Sarah against the wall, his lips finding hers, all restraint gone. Sarah shuddered as his hands slid down her back, pulling her closer. Their breaths mingled, hot, urgent, as if they would disappear if they hesitated even a second. Too fast, yet too slow. James traced his lips down her neck, his voice husky. One last time. Sarah closed her eyes. She didn't believe him, and she didn't believe herself either. But right now, none of that mattered. When it was over, they lay beside each other, their skin still warm from the touch. The room was dark, filled only with the sound of their quiet breathing. Sarah rested her head against James's chest, staring at the ceiling. "Are we really going to stop?" she asked, her voice so soft it nearly dissolved into the air. James was silent for a long time. Finally, he pressed a kiss to her hair and whispered, "Yes," the most beautiful lie they had ever believed. Sarah tried to return to her normal life. She went to work, laughed with her colleagues, took care of Lily like the devoted mother she had always been. She sent messages of encouragement to Ethan, played the role of the faithful wife waiting for her husband's return. But every time her phone buzzed, every time she walked past a familiar street, every time she stepped into the cold, dark bedroom, James's face appeared in her mind. She thought she could bury this forever. But guilt doesn't disappear. It only sleeps, waiting for the day it awakens. James too. He still came home on time, still talked to Rachel, still held his wife every morning as if nothing had changed. But when Rachel slept, he would watch her for a long time, wondering what he had become. Did he love his wife? Yes. Then why couldn't he stop thinking about Sarah? The answer was brutally simple. Because Sarah made him feel alive again. But as James stood in the bathroom, staring at his reflection in the mirror, he knew that one day he would have to pay the price. That evening, Ethan called home earlier than usual. Sarah was in the kitchen. Lily sat at the table doing her homework. When she picked up the phone, Ethan's voice came from the other end, a little weary but still warm. "Are you okay?" Sarah flinched. "Why do you ask?" "No reason. It's just, your voice sounds different lately." She tightened her grip on the phone. "Different how?" Ethan hesitated for a second, then let out a soft chuckle. "I don't know. Maybe I'm just imagining it." Sarah lowered her hand, watching the kitchen light cast long shadows on the wall. He wasn't imagining it, but she couldn't tell him the truth. "I'm just a little tired," she lied. "Everything's fine." Ethan was silent for a few seconds. "I miss you." Sarah's heart ached. She closed her eyes, forcing herself to smile. "I miss you too." But who was she really missing? Sarah thought she could control everything, that as long as she stayed calm, things wouldn't spiral out of control. She was wrong. The cracks started with the smallest things. She forgot about Lily's parent-teacher meeting, something that had never happened before. She dropped her phone when she saw James' message while Rachel's name flashed on the screen. She started tensing up every time Ethan called unexpectedly, terrified that her voice might betray her. And then one day, Rachel asked her to meet for coffee. They met at a small cafe near Lily's school. Rachel had arrived first, already ordering 2 cups. Sarah sat down, trying to act normal. "What's up?" Rachel stirred her coffee, her gaze lingering on Sarah, watching her every move. "You seem different lately." Sarah froze. Rachel smiled lightly, her voice still gentle but with an edge sharper than usual. "It's just a feeling. Are you okay?" Sarah clenched her hands under the table. She didn't know if Rachel suspected something, or if she was simply a wife trying to understand a friend. "I'm fine," Sarah smiled. Rachel studied her for another moment, then nodded. Good. But as they left the cafe, Sarah felt an invisible pressure tightening around her. Rachel had noticed something. That night, Rachel stood at the doorway of James' office, arms crossed. "Are you hiding something from me?" James looked up from his computer screen, forcing himself to stay calm. "Why would you ask that?" Rachel held his gaze for a long time. "Just a feeling." James let out a small laugh, but it didn't sound real. "You're overthinking." Rachel didn't respond. She just kept looking at him, her eyes deep and searching, as if weighing whether to believe him or not. Finally, she turned and walked away, leaving James sitting there, feeling like he was standing at the edge of a cliff. This time, he wasn't sure how much longer he could hide. Sarah knew she had to be